Princess Anne had faced funerals, family betrayals, public storms, and private royal reckonings without allowing the world to see her break. But when historians confirmed that Prince Philip had made a solemn vow decades earlier to protect Anne's place inside the monarchy's future, something shifted. The room went still, the papers lay open, and Anne's silence became more powerful than any statement the palace could have issued. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Anne did not reach for the memorandum at first. She stared at it as though the paper itself had carried her father's voice back into the room. Charles sat across from her, his hands still, his face tightened by the kind of recognition no monarch could easily hide. The king understood that this was not only a family memory, this was a direct challenge to the way the palace had treated one of its most dependable servants. A closed archival review at Windsor, a private examination of old royal files to confirm what had been written, approved, and preserved, had suddenly become something far more dangerous than a historical exercise. The senior historian opened the sealed memorandum with both care and fear. A memorandum, in plain language, is a written record meant to preserve an important decision or instruction, and this one carried Philip's own annotation in the margin. Anne read the final line slowly. Her shoulders stayed firm, but her mouth pressed into a hard line, and her eyes filled with emotion she refused to release. Charles watched his sister lower the page into her lap, and he knew at once that Philip's vow had not been made for ceremony. It had been made because he believed Anne's strength would one day be used against her. Silence sharpened every breath in the room. The historians confirmed that Philip had privately vowed decades earlier that Anne would never be pushed aside from the monarchy's inner duty structure, the trusted circle of responsibilities that shapes who carries influence behind royal events, memorials, and future decisions. That mattered because Anne had spent her life doing the work without demanding the praise. It mattered because the palace often rewarded softness in public while relying on steel in private. And Philip, more than anyone, had known exactly where his daughter's steel came from. Charles leaned forward when the historian revealed the second notation. Philip had written that Anne's role must remain protected if future palace politics ever tried to sideline her authority. The king looked down, then back at her, and the old distance between brother and sister seemed to collapse. Anne folded the document shut, but before anyone could speak, the historian added one final detail. Another name had been linked to the vow, and that name changed the meaning of everything. But before Anne could understand why Philip had tied her future to that hidden promise, the palace had to confront the people whose lives were suddenly caught inside it. This was never just about a document. It was about a father, a daughter, a king, and a family still living under the shadow of a man whose judgment had shaped the monarchy for generations. Prince Philip was gone, but his words had returned with force. And for Princess Anne, Charles, and William, the vow did not feel like history. It felt like a command. Anne carried that command in silence after the archival room emptied. She did not ask for comfort. She did not explain herself. She moved to the window, placed one hand on the back of a chair, and held it so tightly that the small gesture said what her voice would not. She had always been Philip's most disciplined child, the one who understood his bluntness without being wounded by it, the one who knew that duty was not meant to be decorated with soft phrases. He had taught her endurance, but he had also taught her courage, and now his vow had dragged both lessons back into the present. Charles felt the weight differently. The king was not only Philip's son in that moment, he was the monarch responsible for deciding whether his father's warning would be honored or quietly absorbed by the palace machine. He knew Anne's place inside the family had always been unusual. She did not chase applause, yet she carried burdens others avoided. She did not demand influence, yet her judgment had steadied the crown through years of private strain. That was why Philip's vow mattered. It proved that he had seen what many around Anne had taken for granted. Anne remembered a sentence Philip had once given her without ceremony. "Loyalty without courage means nothing." He had said it years earlier, almost sharply, as though tenderness made the truth weaker. Now those words returned with a force that made her breathing slow. She had been loyal through grief, loyal through scandal, loyal through moments when others became symbols, while she remained the worker behind the curtain. But this vow revealed something painful. Philip had known that one day her loyalty might not be enough to protect her from being diminished. Charles later spoke to William in private, and his voice was lower than usual. The king admitted that seeing Anne emotional had unsettled him more than the memorandum itself. William understood why. Anne did not let pain become public. She buried it beneath service, timing, discipline, and dry resolve. So if Philip's words had reached her so deeply, then the vow was not ceremonial history. It was a warning with a living wound beneath it. William learned from a historian that Philip had attached the vow to a broader caution about personal ambition shaping royal decisions. The future king heard the phrase and went still. This had never been simply about honoring Anne. It had been about stopping a future court faction from weakening her influence when the monarchy became vulnerable. And as the family examined the forgotten references around the vow, one truth became impossible to avoid. Philip had not written from sentiment, he had written from memory. And when the palace turned back to that forgotten day, the true reason behind Philip's vow began to rise from the past. Every royal storm has a beginning. Some begin with scandal, others with silence. This one began decades earlier, at a private Windsor investiture rehearsal, when Prince Philip watched Princess Anne be deliberately moved out of a central ceremonial position to satisfy a quieter palace arrangement. No headlines followed, no public argument erupted, but Philip saw it. And what he saw became the trigger for a vow. Philip understood humiliation when it hid behind good manners. He had spent enough years inside palace life to know that not every insult arrived loudly. Some arrived through a changed order of entry, a quiet removal from a duty, a rewritten page passed from one hand to another. That day, Anne had already prepared for her role. She knew the duty. She understood the meaning. She had been personally approved for the central ceremonial position, and then, without warning, she was moved aside, as though her readiness meant nothing. Anne accepted the change because that was how she had been trained to survive the institution she served. An investiture, in plain terms, is a royal ceremony where honors are formally presented, and a rehearsal decides exactly who stands where, who speaks, and who carries symbolic weight in the room. That mattered because placement was never just placement. Inside royal life, position could signal trust, authority, and rank without a single word being spoken. Anne knew it. Philip knew it. And when she was shifted to a secondary place without explanation, the silence around the decision became almost cruel. Anne did not protest. She did not demand that anyone correct the arrangement. She simply removed her gloves slowly, one finger at a time, using the small movement to hide the sting. Philip watched his daughter with the sharpness of a man who missed very little. He saw the discipline. He saw the hurt beneath it, and more painfully, he saw how easily others mistook her composure for permission. Anne had learned how to endure, but endurance was never supposed to make her invisible. Philip confronted a senior aide afterward in a narrow corridor, his voice controlled but cold. He asked who had decided his daughter's service could be treated like movable furniture. The aide's answer was careful, polished, and dangerous. Anne had been shifted, he suggested, to avoid offending another household faction seeking greater ceremonial visibility. Philip heard the truth beneath the words. Someone had chosen convenience over merit. Someone had weighed Anne's silence against another person's ambition and decided she would absorb the insult. That evening, Philip wrote the first private note that would later become the vow. He declared that Anne's role must never again be weakened by palace convenience. The words were not sentimental. They were protective, sharp, and final. Decades later, when the historians placed that vow before the family, the memory of the rehearsal returned with force, because it suggested the old mistake had not died with time. Someone had tried to repeat it. The past had named its wound, but the present still had to face the person Anne believed had allowed that wound to reopen. The confrontation did not happen before cameras. It did not unfold in a grand hall or beneath chandeliers. It happened in a private room where the door closed softly and the silence became unbearable. Princess Anne stood across from King Charles, not as a subject before a monarch, but as a sister before a brother. And between them lay Philip's vow, heavy with judgment. Anne had asked for the meeting herself, and that alone carried force. She did not want aides in the room. She did not want secretaries shaping the language. She did not want advisors turning pain into procedure. She wanted Charles to hear the matter from her mouth, without anyone softening its edges. The king agreed because he understood what the historians had truly placed before them. Philip's vow was not just an old family note. It had dragged private memory into the living structure of royal power, and now every choice around Anne's role seemed to carry her father's shadow. Anne placed the memorandum on Charles's desk with a calmness that felt more dangerous than anger. A memorandum is a formal written record, often used to preserve an instruction or decision, and this one mattered because it carried Philip's warning in words no one could easily dismiss. She looked at her brother and asked whether he had known their father feared she would one day be pushed aside again. Charles did not answer quickly. He removed his glasses, set them beside the document, and stared at the page as though the ink had become an accusation. Charles knew any reply could sound like betrayal. If he said yes, he would admit he had carried knowledge without acting. If he said no, he would admit the palace had moved around Anne without even recognizing the insult Philip had tried to prevent. The silence stretched until it became its own confession. Anne did not raise her voice. That made it worse. She spoke with the steady control of someone who had already endured the injury and was now demanding that it be named. Anne then revealed the wound that had reopened everything. A recent internal proposal had reduced her ceremonial oversight in favor of a more polished public-facing arrangement. Ceremonial oversight, in plain terms, means the trusted responsibility for guiding certain royal duties, appearances, and symbolic roles so they carry the right authority and meaning. That mattered because Anne's work was never decorative. It was built on experience, loyalty, and the kind of discipline the monarchy depended on when glamour was not enough. Charles admitted he had seen the proposal. The words landed heavily between them. He insisted he had not understood how closely it echoed the old rehearsal Philip had never forgotten. But the explanation could not erase the damage. Anne listened, still and wounded, because the truth was now impossible to avoid. The palace had almost repeated the very insult their father had warned against. Anne left the room without shouting, without pleading, without giving Charles an easy way to comfort her. The door closed behind her, and the king remained with the memorandum on his desk, knowing the decision could no longer be delayed or hidden behind polished palace language. Once Charles understood that silence itself could become betrayal, the question became who actually held the power to honor Philip's vow. Inside the monarchy, power does not always announce itself. Sometimes it moves through calendars, precedence lists, ceremonial assignments, sealed notes, and quiet approvals written in careful ink. Philip understood that better than anyone. His vow was not emotional decoration, it was a safeguard. And now, as Charles reviewed the machinery surrounding Anne's role, the palace saw how easily loyalty could be edited. Charles sat with the papers long after the confrontation should have ended. He had heard Anne's pain, but now he had to face the system that had allowed it to happen. The king knew the danger was not only in one proposal or one careless adjustment, it was in the quiet machinery around the crown, where small changes could reshape a person's standing without ever sounding like an attack. Event placement meant where a royal figure appeared during major occasions, and that mattered because position could signal influence before anyone spoke. Ceremonial oversight meant control over the meaning and order of royal duties, and Anne's reduced role showed how easily trust could be taken away under the language of planning. William studied the briefing papers with visible restraint. The prince did not interrupt. He simply tapped one finger against the table, once, then again, as the truth settled in front of him. Anne's service had been treated as negotiable, not rejected, not openly challenged. Negotiable. That was what made it worse. She had given decades to the monarchy with discipline others praised only when convenient, and now the record showed that her authority could be softened, narrowed, and moved aside, while everyone pretended nothing serious had changed. Charles felt the pressure of kingship tighten around him. The monarch could not honor Philip's vow with emotion alone. He had to decide whether to overrule advisors who believed they were protecting the institution from tension, headlines, and family discomfort. Philip's vow carried moral force rather than legal dominance. meaning it did not operate like a law that the palace had to obey. But its historical weight made ignoring it dangerous, because it came from a man whose judgment had shaped the royal family through crisis after crisis. To dismiss it would not look practical. It would look like betrayal. A senior historian then pointed to a marginal note in Philip's handwriting. The note warned that Anne's authority should remain intact during any future transition of royal influence. A transition, in plain language, meant a period when the monarchy's power, duties, and public image passed from one generation to the next. That mattered because transitions invite ambition. They create openings. They allow old loyalties to be rewritten as new strategies. Philip had seen that risk coming, and he had left his warning exactly where the family would one day be forced to find it. The review uncovered the most painful detail. The recent proposal had not removed Anne publicly. It had quietly diluted her control over several symbolic responsibilities, making the change easier to defend and harder to challenge. Charles asked for the complete list of alterations. The room stiffened. William stopped tapping the table. And when the first name attached to the proposal was read aloud, the silence changed. The palace had found the mechanism, but the fallout began when Anne learned exactly how far the changes had already gone. The first consequence was not a public announcement. It was a pause in a hallway. A secretary carrying revised papers stopped when Princess Anne appeared at the far end, because everyone suddenly understood that the old order had cracked. Philip's vow had turned from memory into pressure, and Anne, who had spent her life serving without complaint, now saw the cost of staying silent. By then, the palace had already begun moving pieces before anyone dared to call it a confrontation. A major commemorative duty, long connected to Anne's steady hand and quiet discipline, had been marked for reassignment in revised papers that looked harmless at first glance. The language was clean, almost polite. It spoke of modernization, of efficiency, of refreshing responsibilities for a changing reign. But beneath those careful words was something colder, because once the historians confirmed the meaning behind Philip's vow, the change no longer looked like progress. It looked like a breach, not loud enough to cause scandal, not bold enough to invite immediate resistance, just deliberate enough to wound. Anne received the revised schedule in a quiet anteroom, away from the noise of courtiers and ceremonial planning. She read the line once, then again, slower the second time, as though the ink itself had betrayed her. No outburst came, no demand rang through the room. She simply placed the paper flat on the table, and that silence carried more force than anger ever could. For a woman who had spent decades accepting the hardest duties without applause, the insult was not only that something had been taken from her, it was that duty itself had been repackaged, polished, and moved aside, as though loyalty were just another administrative detail. When Sophie entered moments later, she understood, before a word was spoken. She saw that Anne was not merely furious. She was hurt in a way the palace rarely allowed anyone to admit. The trusted confidant looked at the schedule, then at the handwritten note pressed into the margin, and the truth became harder to ignore. Anne had not been removed in one dramatic decision. She had been eased out through small adjustments, each one designed to seem too minor to challenge. A changed title here, a shifted meeting there, a ceremonial note altered just enough to blur the old promise. And then came the detail that turned discomfort into warning. The instruction in the margin suggested the changes were to be completed before the family could object, before questions could harden. Before Philip's vow could become more than history, Sophie lowered her voice and told Anne that Charles had called for one final private discussion. This time, there would be no files to hide behind, no secretaries to soften the meaning, and no polished phrasing to protect anyone from the truth. What began as a historical confirmation now moved toward a human reckoning, where brother and sister would have to speak without the monarchy standing between them. The turning point came without witnesses, no aides, no historians, no advisors waiting outside with prepared phrases. Just Charles and Anne in a private sitting room, two children of Philip carrying different burdens from the same father. The king had spent his life learning how to speak for the crown, but in that room, Anne needed him to speak as a brother. That was why Charles chose Windsor, and not an official office lined with authority. He brought Anne into a family space, away from the polished machinery of palace language, away from the desks where decisions could be disguised as procedure. It was a small choice, but it mattered, because after days of rising tension, every detail carried weight. Philip's vow had done more than reopen an old question. It had forced the family to face something far more dangerous: whether duty could still survive when personal trust had been quietly broken. Charles understood that now, but understanding had come late. He looked at Anne, not as a monarch defending a decision, but as a brother standing before the sister who had carried burden after burden without asking to be rescued. He told her he had failed to see the emotional meaning behind the proposed changes. The words were simple, almost painfully bare. Anne did not answer at once. She looked away, and that was when the apology reached where anger could not. Because rage could protect her, silence could steady her, but an honest admission from him cut through both. Then Anne said what the palace had never wanted spoken aloud. Philip's vow had wounded her because it proved he had seen her pain long before she had allowed herself to name it. He had noticed the strain beneath her discipline, the loneliness beneath her loyalty, the cost of always being reliable while others were allowed to be fragile. And now, after his passing, that private understanding had returned like a verdict, not against the monarchy alone, but against every soft betrayal hidden behind words like modernization and transition. Charles did not argue. He did not reach for explanation. Instead, he revealed his decision. Anne's ceremonial oversight would be restored, and Philip's vow would be preserved in the family archive with formal acknowledgement. It was not merely a reversal, it was recognition. But Anne, still guarded by years of hard service, asked the question that cut through the room: was this being done for optics or conviction? The answer came without performance. Charles handed her Philip's memorandum and left no copy on the table, no duplicate beside him, no document held back as a symbol of control. For once, he was not managing the damage. He was surrendering the weight of it. Anne accepted the decision quietly, but quiet did not mean the matter was over. The palace still had to explain why a change had been made, then undone, and why the restoration felt bigger than a title or a ceremony. The private promise had been restored, but outside the palace walls, the story was about to become a public symbol of loyalty, memory, and royal consequence. By morning, the story no longer belonged only to Windsor. It had crossed into newspapers, broadcasts, and public imagination, reshaping how Britain looked at Princess Anne. For decades, she had been seen as the tireless worker, the unsentimental royal, the one who simply carried on. Now the country saw something deeper. Behind the discipline was a daughter still carrying her father's faith in her. The palace tried to control the moment with careful language, but some truths are too emotional to be contained by official wording. The acknowledgement confirmed that Philip's archival memorandum had been recognized, and that Anne's ceremonial responsibilities would remain protected. It did not shout, it did not confess. It moved with the measured tone of an institution that knew every word would be examined. Yet beneath that restraint was a thunderclap. Because this was not only about a duty restored, it was about memory being given authority. It was about a father's private faith in his daughter reaching beyond grief and forcing the monarchy to correct itself. The announcement landed differently from ordinary palace statements. It carried something rare, almost dangerous: feeling. Family memory had been tied directly to the monarchy's future, and the public understood that at once. This was not a dry correction buried in procedure. It was a signal that even inside the oldest institutions, loyalty still had a pulse. Anne watched the coverage from a small breakfast room, her tea untouched, her face still composed by habit. Sophie sat nearby and said very little, because she knew silence was sometimes the only kindness left. But when Philip's name was read aloud, Anne blinked hard, and that brief movement revealed what no statement ever could. Charles saw the morning papers separately, yet the weight reached him just the same. One photograph stopped him. Anne beside Philip, both captured in a moment that now felt less like history and more like prophecy. The king paused over it, visibly moved by how the public had interpreted the vow. They were not treating it as palace gossip, they were treating it as proof. Proof that Philip had known who would endure. Proof that Anne's service had not gone unnoticed. Proof that quiet loyalty, when finally recognized, could shake louder than scandal. Then came the front page that turned the story into a national verdict. A major newspaper placed Anne in profile beneath the headline, "Philip's Promise Kept," with a smaller image of Windsor Castle below it. The message was unmistakable. This was no longer only about internal correction. It had become a symbol of a daughter vindicated, a father remembered, and a monarchy forced to face the emotional cost of its own decisions. Outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd gathered near the gates, not in outrage, but in solemn recognition. One older veteran told a broadcaster he knew she would never fail the crown. The words traveled faster than any palace briefing, because they carried what the institution could not easily say. Anne had been trusted before she had been defended, seen before she had been restored, and honored only after the truth became impossible to ignore. The public response transformed the palace's private decision into something larger, something the crown could not step around. Philip's vow had become an emotional standard by which duty, loyalty, and family would now be measured. And when the noise finally settled, the meaning of the vow became clearer than the controversy that had revealed it. In the end, the vow was not about power, it was about recognition. Prince Philip had seen Princess Anne clearly, when others saw only utility, discipline, and silence. He had understood that the daughter who never demanded attention might one day need protection from those who mistook restraint for weakness. And when that protection finally emerged, it gave Anne something greater than authority. It gave her vindication. Anne had spent a lifetime proving loyalty without asking anyone to praise it. That was why the monarchy's final decision carried such force. Philip's memorandum, a written note kept for the family record, preserving his private instruction and belief, was placed into the family archive, the protected collection where personal royal papers are stored for future generations. The palace also reaffirmed Anne's restored ceremonial responsibilities, meaning the formal duties connected to remembrance, tribute, and royal continuity would remain under her care. This mattered because it did not simply correct a schedule. It admitted that duty can be wounded when the people behind it are treated like replaceable names on a page. The decision became a defining family moment because Philip's promise proved that private devotion could still shape public duty long after the person who made it was gone. Anne understood that better than anyone. She visited St. George's Chapel alone, the sacred Windsor church where generations of royal memory rest, and stood in silence, with the weight of her father's faith pressing against her heart. One tear fell before she straightened herself again, not because the pain had vanished, but because discipline had always been the language he admired in her. The daughter who rarely broke had not been made weak by emotion. She had been made human. Charles carried the meaning differently, but he carried it deeply. Later, the king told William that honoring the vow was not a concession to the past, but a correction the present owed to both Anne and Philip. William listened because he understood the warning beneath those words. A monarchy can survive argument, it can survive change, but it cannot survive for long if loyalty is quietly erased by convenience. Charles knew the restoration was not about elevating his sister above others. It was about making sure the woman who had served without theatrics was not pushed aside without honor. Then the final revelation settled over the family like a truth no one could escape. Philip's vow had never been designed to create victory over anyone. It was designed to protect Anne from being forgotten in plain sight. The true shock was not that he made the promise. The true shock was that he had known, decades earlier, exactly where she might one day be wounded. He had seen the danger before the palace named it. He had read the silence before others respected it. And when that silence finally broke, it did not break into scandal. It broke into recognition. This moment confirmed Anne as more than the monarchy's steady worker. She became the living proof that loyalty, when finally recognized, can outlast silence, politics, and time itself. Philip's vow had returned not to divide the family, but to restore what had always been true. Princess Anne had earned her place, and this time, no one could move her from it. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.